Hi, I'm Mike Galsworthy, and this is Unbreak the Planet, where we talk about what's really messed up in the world right now and bring in guests to help us find the solutions that we need right now. Damian, thanks for joining me here. Now, you are Damian Collins MP, the MP for Folkestone and Hythe. And at the moment, you're particularly interested in disinformation because you are the chair of the Joint Committee on the draft online safety bill, right? And this has followed from your work in chairing the Digital Media, Cultural and Sport Select Committee, which you have been on since 2010 or something like that.
On and off,
right? And you have also, from that, written reports and done investigations into disinformation in the political sphere, which then got adapted into government's white paper on online harms. And you were also, on top of that, part of the real Facebook Oversight Board, which not a lot of people probably know what that is. So if you could give us a brief summary of what exactly is that?
Sure. Well, I mean, just as well on the parliamentary processes that you set out as well. I would say we're probably on a journey that goes back to 2017. So looking back over the last 4 years, where we've become more aware of not just the existence of disinformation campaigns, electoral interference, campaigns of hate directed at people. We've become more aware of those, and we've become more questioning of the role that social media companies play in allowing that content to exist. And so we've seen a sort of an ongoing debate that has taken us up to the point where we are now, where the UK government has got a legislation proposal, the online safety bill, which is in draft form. And I'm chairing a group of parliamentarians that have been asked by the government to do a scrutiny of that bill to make sure that we think it works and suggest ways it should change. With the real Facebook Oversight Board, again, that was set up, I think, to look at the central issue of saying, well, we should be critical of the way in which companies like Facebook regulate content on their platform, about the way they use their recommendation tools. We should be questioning of it. Facebook had said it was going to set up its own oversight board of global experts who would advise it on content moderation. It announced it and then did absolutely nothing about setting it up. So the real Facebook Oversight Board was set up to bring together a similar group of people. So we have, as you said, I'm on it, Roger McNamee, who many people will know is a former tech investor, was an early investor in Facebook itself. Maria Ressa, who's a campaigning journalist who's under multiple threats of legal action in the Philippines for her work. But people who have different experiences on the issues and can speak about them and challenge Facebook on the decisions it makes.
So as you were telling me before, the actual Facebook Oversight Board has now kicked into gear, possibly as a response to you guys coming out or pressure in general. Do you trust them to make good decisions?
There are some really good people on the if you like, the actual Facebook Oversight Board. Yep. I would question.
So we were also saying before, this is a bit like Sage, an independent Sage, where you have the outside kick up the rear end in order to prompt the real one also to behave better.
Yeah, but there are some really good people on the if you like, the actual Facebook Oversight Board. I would question why some of them have allowed their names to be used in this project. Right. I think the Facebook Oversight Board is, I think it's principally a PR exercise by Facebook.
So something of a fig leaf to we're doing something. Look, we're talking to them.
And the reason I say that is not because it's not full of independently minded people who are extremely experienced and have had great careers behind them. It's because the remit they have is so narrow. There's not very much they can do. So when they meet, they look at content that Facebook has removed from the platform, and they have to determine whether Facebook was right to remove it or not. What they're not allowed to do is launch any wider investigation of content on Facebook. They can't say, well, why is there this content on here which we think might be problematic but wasn't taken down at all? They're not allowed to do that. When they review content, they review it almost like it's printed out on a piece of paper. I don't know if it physically is, but maybe. And they're saying, well, this individual example, should that have been there or not? When really the problem is not just that bad people post bad things and other people see it. It's that the recommendation tools of companies like Facebook, so Facebook Newsfeed recommends and ranks and promotes content to users, and that in some ways could be the most harmful thing. If you take racist speech, I mean that's sadly always existed in society. But if the worst someone could do was share their views with everyone in the pub, then that might be unpleasant, but there's a limited impact it has.
Yep.
When you can broadcast those views to tens of millions of people in rapid time, and Facebook plays the role in doing that, that's the bit you want to be scrutinizing. And the Oversight Board has no oversight of that.
So this is your freedom of speech versus freedom of reach thing that I've heard you talk about before, that, people will share ideas, but if you've got a platform geared to finding those people and enticing them down all their different rabbit holes together to build a community, then you get something dangerous. Yeah. So talking about that, to dive into a real example of where this is causing actual threat now, I'm a scientist. In the science community, we have always seen the flat earthers, the anti-vaxxers, the creationists, those who are broadly anti-science and antagonistic towards science. And fortunately for us, mercifully for us in the UK and Europe as a whole, that's always been very small. It's larger in the States, where you've also got some political alignment traditionally that has been with it. But now what we're seeing with the coronavirus pandemic and the pressure of masks and vaccines, which most of the population readily take up, you are getting some people who are highly resistant to that, and they are organizing via social media. So we have seen recently mobs trying to storm the MHRA building and ITN building. And recently there was a NHS plaque that had sprayed on it, NHS liars, misspelt, with CV19, so we know what it's about, and a nice little swastika to boot. And this is terrifying for doctors and nurses who are, facing this themselves. And Byline TV actually this weekend went out and interviewed the regular weekly, every Saturday turnout of Piers Corbyn and others, making some very aggressive threats about how the lying NHS and government and scientists need to go through a similar process to Nuremberg trials. And, Kate Cheromani having famously said that, doctors and nurses that supported the Nazis were hung. So these people also said in those interviews that they organize via Facebook. That's how they come together. So what is, given that this is booming now and it's not just online, it's actually hitting the streets and actually threatening real people, how does the government view these developments? What do you and other committees around Parliament and the government think needs to be done to tackle those actual real physical threats that could be riding off the back of this?
Well, you ask a really important question, which is that it's not just that disinformation campaigns spread on social media and that social media has given them a mechanism to reach people in a way they never could have done before. I think it's impossible to think of the rise of the anti-vax movement or conspiracy networks like QAnon without social media there to amplify them. Part of the problem is that the social media business model is based on engagement. And it tends to see all engagement as being positive. And I think, sadly, what we're seeing is that disinformation is good for business as well, that it engages more people than factual information does. And therefore, there was a study looking at the 2020 presidential election in America which showed that misinformation was 8 times more likely to spread than factual news was. And there are reasons we can go on for that, which we can discuss. But then the question is, it's not just that happens, but it's changing real world behaviors. I think it is normalizing these ideas. It is sending people on a journey where they're shown ever more extreme versions of that content because the platform thinks they're more likely to engage with it. It is radicalizing people. People then organize events and demonstrations and protests in response to that. And you see some of the events that you've described. Yeah. And I think social media is central to that. So there is a kind of, there's a policing role in trying to contain that. And if people are committing violent acts and offences in the real world, well, then we have rules and mechanisms to deal with that. But how do we deal with that effect that radicalizes people and sends them on a journey to the extent that they take to the streets, behave in the way they do? And is there a role for social media companies to try to recognize the danger, to recognize that what we're seeing is potentially an incitement, inciting a riot or inciting a mob to gather and behave in a way which could threaten sort of life and property and other people? And how do we then intervene in that process earlier than we do? Because at the moment, we would look at that and say, well, actually the interventions come when the mob turn up and start demonstrating on the streets and people could get hurt. Now, people have got a right to demonstrate, but I think we should be concerned if people are being misled by disinformation and radicalized to behave in ever more extreme ways.
Yeah. So here's something that has occurred to me. Do you, in all of the evidence you've taken so far in various different roles, have a sense of which social media platforms are more dangerous than others down certain routes or avenues? Because, for example, Facebook is very much about communities, completely off the radar. All of these communities that have organized a lot of these demonstrations, I'm not part of them. I don't see them when I go on Facebook. Twitter is very different. Twitter is very much like an open playground. Everyone's keeping each other in check, sometimes nastily, albeit, but you see within the political sphere and social political sphere a lot more interaction. You can see the playground, as it were, from a helicopter view more easily. TikTok is an interesting one because that's flourishing and booming, and you're getting a lot of political and mysticism and music and different communities growing there. But I've noticed within the political domain, there's lots of takedown videos of other people's videos. So there's that opportunity to catch and react. But then YouTube is much more like Facebook, whereby it's, did you like that? Well, then here's the same kind of thing, here's the same kind of thing, and taking you on a journey where you're not actually seeing two sides of an argument. Whereas Instagram is far more pressuring people into certain communities relating to, self-harm or eating disorder or views of themselves. So is there a way of taking a more scientific approach as to, across the whole spread of these things, what are the types of doing social media that lead to specific harms, and which ones do not send the radicals on marches or do not send teenagers into hospitals?
So I think there has to be a sort of general duty of care that we expect social media companies to have, whereby, when they can see harmful behavior on their platforms, which is likely to cause harm to other people, that we expect them to intervene. We don't just regard them as being totally neutral platforms where users upload stuff, other people see it, and they're just the platform in the middle. They're totally neutral of the space. They're not neutral because they curate what's there. They promote and they recommend stuff to people based on their interests to keep them engaged. But the problems are different on different platforms. I think so. I think Facebook has scale. It has the most active users, active monthly users for a social media platform. It has a lot of people on it. So Facebook has been, I think, the place where conspiracy networks can gather. They can gather in closed private groups. They can gather in groups with increasingly large audiences. They can act in a coordinated fashion to help game the Facebook algorithm to make sure that get their content amplified by the news feed and reach a lot of people. Twitter, I think, has become sort of, I think, more of a problem for the sort of flash mobs of hate. Like England footballers getting racist abuse, or people in public eye getting racist abuse. But Twitter doesn't stop people from having anonymous accounts. So again, people can hide their identity. So you see that problem there.
I've got that further down the list because that's an important one.
TikTok, I think with TikTok, there's an issue that is on other platforms, but I think it's particularly strong on TikTok, which is the way that TikTok For You works.
The For You page. Now,
the For You page is not based on accounts that you follow. It is based on...
It's just that linear feed, and you keep going next. So you drink what they give you.
It's a data. It is your data profile. For You is your data profile, and therefore, but if you're a teenage girl that is engaged in TikTok films about extreme dieting, or glamorizing self-harm, that TikTok will be actively recommending that to you. So we should be worried about that.
There's a good side to that too, because I've come across some great science and magic videos on TikTok, and I happily scroll through all those. Oh, follow that guy, save that. And there's lots of really good quality content as well. But if you're slightly vulnerable, then an AI algorithm is really going to hook into that early on and be able to drag you off.
But then also, I was reading this the other day, which I thought was really interesting, and I think also to shows you that sometimes, we can see the problems, we can never know what the motivation is for some people, what they do. And there was this, there's a conspiracy around lots of conspiracies around President Kennedy's assassination. But one of them was with a slightly unusual man who was wearing a black overcoat and holding a black umbrella, and standing very close to the point where on the side of the road where when the car was shot at. that. And there was all sorts of conspiracy theories of who this man was and why he was doing it, and had he got some sort of device in his umbrella, and why had he got an umbrella up when it was a sunny day. And it turned out years later they sort of tracked him down and interviewed him, and he was protesting about Joe Kennedy, the president's father, pro-appeasement policies in the 1930s. And Neville Chamberlain was known as the man with the umbrella. So he stood there by the castle holding his black umbrella. Now, and this prompted a massive conspiracy industry for years. But the truth behind it was very simple. And I think sometimes we can never know what motivates people to behave in the way they do. But I think rather than these being individual acts of protest or eccentricity, they're now on social media, they can be amplified into something totally different.
Yes, things can get quite out of control with them. So then we've got different kind of actors in here. We've got the platforms themselves. We've got those that are deliberately intent on disinformation. Deliberate bad actors setting up bots, trying to drive agendas. We've got the sort of hapless, if you will, amplifiers of this that could either be slightly disingenuous or complete victims. And then you've also got state actors, you've got governments themselves that want to be regulating. So what actions need to be taken with these, 4 different players? That you've got the platforms, and you think platforms should be self-regulating?
Well, no, I think they should be self-regulating, but I think to achieve that, to make it effective, it requires independent regulators that can audit them and inspect them and set standards as well. So I think we can't leave it to
the government should not be regulating them direct, but they should be setting up regulators of the platforms.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then what is to be done with the deliberately disingenuous actors when you can, to a reasonable degree, prove that, and they can easily leave one platform and go on to another?
So the question of people like that. So it partly depends what they're doing. Now, the platforms themselves have made interventions on anti-vaccine conspiracy theories or bogus medical treatments to cure COVID. And the platforms recognize that actually, if you followed the advice of these conspiracy theorists, you could harm yourself, or if you pass that advice on, you could harm other people. And therefore, there's a clear known harm involved there. Yeah. I think there's an interesting debate around things like financial scams, because the fact that they exist online doesn't mean to say they're okay. We have legislation that protects the consumer from fraud. Yeah. Now, the issue on social media is it's hard to see who's doing it. But that doesn't mean we should do nothing at all, which is sort of what the defaults become. So you can set standards for different sorts of content and say, this is what we would expect a responsible company to do in dealing with that. We have equalities legislation in this country, which means you can't abuse people because of their gender or their ethnicity or their religious beliefs. But it happens online largely because it's difficult to trace who's doing it. Yeah. And the companies say, well, actually, we're not the ones doing it. It's other people who are doing it. So, if you're going to prosecute someone under the Equalities Act, it's them and not us. But they have a vital role in the middle, and I think that unless they're effective at moderating that content, they make that problem worse. And I think that's so. A lot of it is looking about how we translate existing areas of legislation on equalities, on harassment, on fraud, and make that effective in the online space. But also this idea of a kind of general duty, which is that where the platforms can see a pattern of behavior like cyberbullying or taunting or abuse of somebody, maybe just one individual bit of that wouldn't necessarily be illegal, but the pattern is harmful, and we want companies to be responsible in that way too. And that's why I think we have to set up what these standards are.
But liable? If someone were to commit suicide because of constant bullying and taunting on an issue where this had been complained about to the company, are the company liable for their assisting role in that harassment if someone felt as though they had to be on that platform?
Well, I think that is a very interesting question. I would certainly say that if the company could see a pattern of behavior had been reported to them, they did nothing to protect that account user from that content, and I would say to try and close down the accounts that were engaged in that practice, then I think they would have failed in their duty of care in that respect. In the system that we're looking at here, the regulator, I think, would take action against them for that failure. I think there's an interesting additional point to that as well, which is not really something that's expressly covered in the online safety bill, but could happen as a consequence of it, which is, would we have a mechanism in civil law where someone might say, well, I've lost a member of my family because of your negligence.
Yep.
The regulator said that you failed in your duty of care in this case, and therefore I'm going to take civil action against you in the courts because of your failure. And I think that if that is how this develops, that really would, I think, focus the attention of the tech companies, because they would be open to massive liabilities.
Big buck cases.
Yeah, and absolutely they would. And what the online safety bill does allow for is the idea of class action lawsuits, where you have multiple claimants coming together.
Yeah, which makes it that much more feasible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, to gather up everyone who's had similar experiences. Yeah. That would be an absolute nightmare for some of these big social media platforms, because they'll know there's a ton of stories out there, because all of us are on social media in one form or another. Yeah. So there must be lots of that lurking in the background.
I think that's right. I think, but in addition to that too, the regulator, the online safety regulator, would also have the power for the most serious breaches of the code to fine the companies up to 10% of their annual global revenues as well. So those fines could be very significant. But I think also the idea that you could have negligence claims coming through the courts against the companies by multiple users would also have a big impact.
Now, what about the role of those that unwittingly help spread either misinformation or disinformation because they're anxious citizens and they don't trust the system around them, either rightly or wrongly, and think more people should at least be asking this question? What is to be done with them? Because, I mean, I find oftentimes that the censorship route for people like that sometimes reinforces how they feel, because if they see that the government shutting something down or the medical world shutting something down, it's because they don't want it discussed, and censorship means legitimacy of the fundamental argument that is being shut down. So what do you do there? Because that's the age-old problem of you've got something that that maybe can be provably wrong, but in order to drag it through the media again and again and again to discuss it, then actually legitimizes the argument itself. So how do you work with that when something is appealing but fundamentally wrong, and it's either kind of like shut down or discussed until the end of time?
Again, one of the really important questions and difficult challenges of this problem, what people call sort of friends and family content on social media, which is things that people share between each other. Yeah. And I think we saw this very clearly with COVID, is for a lot of people, they will, as you suggested, they will share just in case. I've seen this. I don't know if it's true or not, but I'll share it with you. You receive it from someone that you know and trust. You think, well, if they think it's important enough to share,
it's got the surprise factor. It's interesting. I didn't think about that. What do you think of that?
Yeah. And also, this is really the way disinformation works as well. And for the people that are behind this cynically and doing it to manipulate and change opinion, what they sometimes want as their outcome is not necessarily to persuade someone of an alternative fact, but to leave people in a position where they don't know what to believe. Yeah, and they also become more suspicious. They become distrusting of the government, distrusting the mainstream media, and then they not only don't know what to believe anymore, they're much more likely to believe something which is a wild conspiracy or something else. Now, where the role for takedown comes in this place is important, but is potentially quite narrow, which is to say that it is. If someone is spreading a message which is likely to incite people to commit a violent or criminal act or to harm themselves, then clearly there's a case for saying, well, that should be taken down. The content that was removed during the pandemic that was encouraging people to set fire to mobile phone masts because they were told the signals on those masts was spreading the virus. Yeah. Particularly 5G was blamed for the spreading of coronavirus. Yes. There's a role for takedown there, but other than that, you do have to have systems of reporting and flagging or marking content to say this is disputed. There's also, I think, a question for the tech companies as well. Facebook made a decision a few years ago to change the way the newsfeed worked so that it favored friends and family content more than it favored content from trusted news sources. Right, yes. Where previously it had been the size of the audience, and the bigger the news organization, the bigger the audience it had, the more trust was given to it.
One of the reasons for doing that was actually to stop Facebook being used as just political channels. Yeah. Because it was increasingly becoming that. So they wanted to make it more friends and family stuff, to be going back to, happy.
Indeed, and but the consequence was the consequence of that decision was the complete reverse.
Interesting.
Because what happened then was, so trusted news sources got crowded out from content that people shared with each other.
Yeah.
So the most viral content ended up being the most extreme content. So the wildest conspiracy theories, the most, sometimes the most abusive behavior. That created a massive amount of engagement. So people saw more of that than they did trusted news.
Yeah. So it's kind of like puts rumors over trusted news.
Exactly, and created a much better environment for these rumors to spread and to dominate, and to crowd out, and to create the point, you crowd out the real news. And so this is where we end up in a position where people say, well, you're more likely to see disinformation than real news on some of these platforms.
Yep.
And what Facebook have done, though, they've seen this change, but what they've seen is this change has driven engagement with the platform. So it's not just that trusted news is crowded out, people are coming back more and more. And they know that,
they've actually benefited
from it. They benefit from it.
So moving on to the next thing then, and you mentioned before the bots and the anonymity. Certainly with the campaign Clean Up the Internet, I've talked with them before. There's this issue of so much of the aggressive behavior, deliberately aggressive behavior, is from those faceless accounts when you can say what you want. It gives them some liberation. And so obviously it makes sense to have more identification. But then sometimes people need to test out ideas. Sometimes people need to be whistleblowers. How do you construct an environment in which people can drop information in that they are, whistleblowers too, or test out ideas, or say they've got a very repressive family and don't want their family finding them or knowing that they're there? How do you give people sort of that liberation of a different identity, but at the same time make sure people aren't abusing that in order to go and do things that are destructive to society and those around them?
Well, I think there's some of the things you can do there. So I don't have a problem with a platform saying we allow people to use a false name, or when
bots. Are there any advantages to bots? Because I can't think of any. I think that should just
also, so they say in America, bots don't have First Amendment rights. Bots don't have freedom of speech rights. So actually, inauthentic behavior. Well, platforms called inauthentic activity, which is that there's no reason they can't close those accounts down. Actually, Facebook's platform policy is not to allow bots. Twitter do. And there's no doubt bots are then used to boost and amplify content and drive content through the system. And the people that are really behind serious campaigns of disinformation have developed networks and systems to make this stuff go viral, to put it in front of as many people as possible. So that can happen. I think what we could say, and this is just something I'm thinking through at the moment, and we're thinking through in the context of the online safety bill as members of the committee, is should we say, well, the platforms should have enough information about a user that they can identify that user. So if a police investigation, say there's a police investigation into an incident that's happened, linked to a particular account, that if you could, rather like the security service have to do if they want to put a phone tap in on someone's phone, they have to go to a judge, they have to get an order that says, okay, we understand the seriousness of this case is such that you can do that. And that, in this case, that could be a request to the social media company. Okay, so we've got a court order that says you must disclose to us information about that account holder that would enable us to continue our investigation and talk to them about their behavior. But that will be done in a very specialist way, that the information wouldn't be public, but it could be made available to law enforcement officers if required.
Gotcha.
In a country like the UK, I think that could work reasonably effectively. It works in other areas of law. The question people always throw up is, okay, but it might work here, but what about in Russia? How that people would be fearful then that the companies would be made to disclose that information to the government. The question I have in my mind here, and I'd be interested in views of listeners to the podcast on this, is actually to what extent in countries like Russia does online anonymity exist anyway? Because the government agencies use spyware to track dissidents and people they know about, and they can discover who they are and where they are and what they're doing.
You're probably better off declaring who you are.
It may well be,
rather than being anonymous.
So I think if we're going to say we got to protect anonymity because in oppressive regimes that enables people to speak out who otherwise wouldn't, I think we have to be really clear. Actually, does that anonymity really exist? Because the governments can use spyware to discover people anyway. In which case, then the role of anonymity is playing is keeping people who are abusive and committing illegal acts in this country, we're giving them protection, but not protecting the victims.
No, fair. So then coming on to away from social harms associated with, anti-vax deniers or trolling of individual people and going into the wider sort of political arena of battles of ideas and truth in battles of ideas. A lot of the work that you did, I think, back in 2016 stemmed from, or starting in 2016, from 2016, when you realized, we could all see that with the Brexit debate, it was open sprawl. With the US election debate, it was open sprawl of ideas, and we could all see the power of social media, particularly Facebook at the time, and however much Cambridge Analytica contributed to anything is almost secondary to people seeing the potential there for a new way of engaging and selling ideas and marketing ideas and getting under the skins of people in ways that they themselves don't understand. And so when we come up to the next general election, what safeguards will we have then against disinformation being used either by political parties or actors outside? I mean, I know Facebook have now registered all of their political ads, and they have that in a library. So you can go and see that, and you can go and see who funds it. But what about the content itself? If that content is deemed to be misleading, who judges that is misleading, and what can they do?
So in the online safety legislation as drafted, there's a general sort of exemption for political campaigns, election campaigns. Now, that is important because I don't think we can get into regulating political speech. I don't think we can, I could have an argument with a Labour politician about the health service. We could both use impeccably sourced facts, clear logical arguments, but be speaking at positions that are poles apart.
Yes.
And that is the nature of political debate. And the job of the voter is to try and analyze what the parties are saying and make their own choice ultimately as to who they trust and who they believe. So you can't regulate that environment.
So that for me is key.
Yeah.
So the rest of us in the public, we can be regulated if we say something that is false. But you as a politician, Damian Collins MP, you can say something that can be judged as being not true by many fact checkers like the BBC fact checker or any others like that. What is it? Full Fact. There we go. That's the one I was thinking of. And then your ads can still fly in your local constituency or on a national level.
So on that, I'd say I think politicians have a degree of jeopardy in what they say. So if a politician says something,
I would disagree.
Well, I'm not sure. Well, okay, but I would say that if you say, if you were going around saying things that weren't true, people would call you up on it. They'd fact check it. You'd be embarrassed about it. That happens. We see that a lot in election campaigns. That happens. I think there's,
we've just had Dawn Butler walk out of Parliament over Boris Johnson saying things in Parliament, such as, it's only because of Brexit that we can have free ports. And every fact checker under the sun will then go and say, well, actually, that's not the case because there are free ports in the EU and we used to have them ourselves until 2013. And that's a nice, clear-cut case of something being said in Parliament from the dispatch box that the vast majority, everyone who really analyses it will have to come to the conclusion that's false. Yeah. So if it does not start in Parliament and with our politicians, if politicians are giving themselves an exemption, then it does feel very much like one rule for them, because you just have to trust politicians that if they say anything wrong, then the public will take them down. But we see that that's not the case. We see with Donald Trump, you know full well yourself that in 2020, you had a huge social movement to then go and storm the Capitol building. Yep. And it took Twitter themselves, knowing that they were taking a risk, shutting down Donald Trump, knowing that he was probably going to go out of office, something they probably wouldn't do if he was saying similarly egregious things while he was still the president and guaranteed to stay so.
Sure, but I think there are two there are two levels to that, which I think, and it's really important. Firstly, on the point about Dawn Butler, so
Yes.
the question there is, she called Boris Johnson a liar.
Yes.
Now we have rules in Parliament which I think are important, which are about motive. So someone may have made a mistake, they may have misspoken, they may have got their facts wrong, but we don't impugn them with a motive of saying they deliberately intended to mislead people. So that's just the way Parliament works. It's unparliamentary language. If you say it, you don't withdraw it. You have to withdraw yourself.
Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I do actually. I do, but I think it's about. I think it's very difficult to have a parliamentary assembly if we don't sort of like, at least we may disagree with each other, but at least we respect each other's motives. And I think as a working rule, that should be there. There is
If there are things that are misspoken in Parliament, right, and people would classify it as either disinformation or just misinformation, and that record is not corrected, then how do we in the country guard against disinformation, misinformation in politics if records don't get corrected in Parliament?
Well, the parliamentary record...
Because let's say that, to give an example, let's say the Prime Minister or one of the ministers says something like, over the past 5 years, we've lifted 1 million people or 2 million people out of poverty. And no one can find data for it anywhere, and people say boo boo, yeah, and whatever. But then we go into a general election, and that clip of them saying it in Parliament gets shared across Twitter, and it's boosted there, and Facebook and all the others. And according to the social media laws, they should all be shutting it down because it's stuff that doesn't check out in a fact-based way. But you, the politicians, have set up a bill that says actually all of that goes. We're cool, but if any citizen were to repeat it, then that would be shut down because it would be a citizen that doesn't have the right to say things that are provably untrue.
Well, no, I think that's not the way.
But do you see my anxiety here?
Well, but also that's not the way it works for the citizen either. I mean, so we're not going to regulate free speech. We're not going to regulate people's rights.
So that means all campaigns, if they're political campaigns, can make whatever claims they like in a general election period.
Well, so okay,
how does that defeat disinformation?
Well, there are. I think you talked earlier about Donald Trump. You could also look at President Bolsonaro in Brazil. Yep. There's not a total exemption from anyone about what they say. So ultimately, Donald Trump was removed from social media because it was felt that Facebook and Twitter felt that he was effectively inciting a riot in Washington, and therefore that was an offence. Bolsonaro had postings removed because it was felt that they could cause harm to people in Brazil, because physical harm because of the things he was saying, and certainly things related to COVID. So there is even a president of a country doesn't have an exemption to say anything they like if what they're saying could lead to physical harm to someone else.
So the boundary is harm to people's health and well-being. The boundary is not any sense of objective truth as such.
Well, I think it's very difficult, I think, to say in this. I think it is linked to harm. It is linked to harm. You could say, now, what about harms to society, harms to democracy? Now, in an election, I certainly think there's a role here for saying, there are some things which are illegal. If you're running ads saying the election isn't on Thursday, it's on Friday, or the polls are open to 11 when they really shut at 10, and you're trying to actually suppress votes, stop people voting, divert them from voting.
So where do you draw the line between a sort of factual argument and a political argument, which is given a bit more grace and room to breathe in?
So what I'm saying is that we have laws around what people can put on political leaflets and to protect the integrity of elections, and those should still apply online as they do elsewhere as well. Yeah. I think when you get into a debate saying actually we're going to have a sort of an arbiter of truth that's going to fact check anything a journalist writes, anything someone says in a posting, anything that a politician says in a campaign, and so we're going to make decisions on moderating that content. That I think becomes practically impossible to do because of the because people have the right to share opinions that others disagree with, or that may be unpopular or controversial. Where I think we should step in though is where people are behaving in a way which is abusive and likely to lead to actual harm to other people, and would be considered illegal in other forums, or would lead to that speech being closed down in other forums. The debate here is to say, well, that is effective offline, but why is it not effective online?
For sure. So, I mean, obviously it's understood the argument with, opinions and whether something has been effective or not effective or important or not important. When it comes to actual facts and data, though, do you think there should be any regulation in that. I mean, certainly in the wider discourse around, like science and medical treatments and things like this. This is something that we wrestle with all the time, because if one paper out of 20 finds something to be effective, and then lots of other papers after it find it actually not to be, and someone goes around, showing its effect, you get into really tricky areas. And yes, you can make the arguments about, well, that pertains to people's health and well-being. But I think if you were to ask most people in the street about political facts and political information, they would want some degree of guarding against absolute outright disagreement on numbers, and having that common space and that common ground. And this isn't me deliberately pointing the finger at Boris Johnson and targeting that. It's the fundamental thing of, as we go forward into more elections, this is a tricky space. It's a very tricky space. And I think a lot of people would think that in elections in years gone by, because there's been more limited sort of channels of communication and arguments, then there has been a better controlled set of, agreed facts, that you agree on the facts and disagree around principles.
I'm not sure it's based on agreed facts. I think it's the channels of communication were narrower.
Yeah.
Well, they reached a wider audience, but they were narrow, and there were fewer of them. And so built into the system then was a politician has made some claim and it's disputed. You might report on the fact that it's been made and it's disputed, or people think they've got their facts wrong. But also an editor could take the view saying, might say, that is so spurious, I'm not going to report it. On the light of the 2020 US presidential election, the networks thought that Donald Trump's claim, TV networks thought his claims that the election had been stolen from him in a fraud was so preposterous, they didn't broadcast his press conference. They stopped doing it.
Yep.
But on social media, it was different.
Yes.
And of course, on social media, it's not even like you're seeing shared media. So for a lot of political discourse, many people will be totally unaware of what people are saying.
Yes.
Because the personalized tool that they will receive is channeled to give them the content they're most likely to be interested in. And one of the challenges here is that it's less about trying to regulate everything everyone says, but it's more about saying, what is the impact of many people only seeing one version of the news and principally getting that from social media, and not having the ability to check that and cross-reference that against other sources, which may have a different view.
So it's making sure that people get lots of different slices of it. So like the BBC has to, present the different angles on it, especially during the election period. But with social media, you could just drink one feed and not be aware of the arguments in play.
And what we see in other countries, I think particularly increasingly in Europe as well, where disinformation is probably at its worst, is where there aren't enough of those strong, trusted state broadcasters, what we call mainstream media, where there's not a strong counterbalance to what you see online, and therefore people become increasingly trusting of it.
That factors into my concerns, because I've done polling before on where people drink their information from, and for the young, for all generations, social media is really rising, but the younger in particular, and the BBC is up there with it, very strong. But there will be people that do get all of their news from social media. So if they're getting all their party political broadcasting from the Labour or the Labour left, or from Brexit Party, which is now Reform UK, or the Conservative Party, just because they get it from social media and their Facebook pages and who advertises to them, then unless there is some kind of buffering around some claims, then they don't get the slap down for some arguments that should be slapped down. And to come back to, for example, the famous 350 million, the Treasury Committee did say at the time, no, that's wrong, stop using it, as did the head of the Royal Statistical Society. And what we saw there was something quite unique in British politics, where Dominic Cummings and Gove and others decided, no, we're going to bulldoze it through anyway because it makes a point, makes a fundamental point. And a lot of people sort of were horrified by that and presumed that in future, elections and referendums would be tightened up so that it's set out better at the outset what's acceptable. Range of what's an acceptable fundamental agreement on where people overstep boundaries in terms of argument, some kind of structure whereby you could agree something like that, because without that I worry that just says, well, that worked, people don't care that much, if they're lied to, so long as it supports their model, especially if this gets supported within their own bubbles. And we live in bubbles these days. And so we're prepared to point fingers at people causing online harm if they're saying things that are provably untrue about health or different groups of people or things like that. But when it comes to politicians, I think it is a big question. How do we keep them as the public would ideally like them to be?
Well, the bus is.
How do we help them? How do we help them stay on the straight and narrow, Damian?
Well, so the bus is a good. It's a good. It's a classic example. It's a good example. Now, you can. And it's not like, I think there's a sense that people will sort of passively consume that message without questioning it. I remember being involved, with debates at the time where there was a vigorous debate around the legitimacy of that figure, and where, but
of course, there are different levels of attention. You'll get some people who say yes, they suckered by it, and other people say no. Of course, we all knew what it was about.
But I think some people would interpret that and say, well, I think the reaction of some people was, violent condemnation of them using the net rather than the gross figure in terms of our contribution to the EU. There were other people who said, well, okay, we're putting money in we could spend on something else. I don't, whether that is 350 million or 300 million or 175 million. Then that's what's happening. So there was a debate around that, and people ultimately made their vote call accordingly. I think with all of this is that I think there's something else happening here which I think we should be more concerned about, which is that yes, there is vigorous political debate, disputed facts. Politicians are challenged on that. Ultimately, those parties and those politicians are judged in the opinion polls, and they may lose votes because of the things they've said, or they may persuade other people. What we're seeing, though, in politics, though, in this country, and this has only really been made possible by social media, is a growing amount of very significant spend asserting often false claims and other rumours, not made by political parties, but by campaign organizations that have suddenly sprung up from nowhere, that are suddenly the biggest spenders on Facebook and political advertising, that are set up and then closed down and they go away again. I mean, and no one knows who's doing it. No one knows who's behind them. And that is the area we should be more concerned about.
There was quite a flurry of that between 2016 and 2019. It really was the Wild West there.
And I think we identified this in the one of the reports the DCMS Select Committee made, where we looked at this organisation called the Mainstream Network, which had been set up to campaign against Theresa May's Brexit deal. It was, I think, for a couple of months, the biggest political spender on Facebook, but no one knew who was doing it. And even with the Facebook ad libraries, which are important because then you try and get rid of what they call dark ads targeted at a user, but no one else can see them. Whereas most ads, like the bus, like the 350 million, is you can see it, everyone can see it. But if it's been targeted to someone you don't know what's been said, the ad library at least tries to create a reputational link between the advertiser and what they're saying to people, and helps people understand why they're being targeted with that message. But
and also you can give different people different messages then. So you don't even have to have your common sort of manifesto and offering, which is on show. You can say, we'll give this money to you. No, we'll give this money to you.
Exactly. So, but even with those, and those are all helpful steps forward. But even taking those into account, we should still be concerned that it's quite easy for people to hide who they really are, where the money's coming from. And then you get into things like foreign countries, like the Russians running ads to interfere in other people's elections.
Yes.
I think when we talk about
do you think that's a big threat going forward? Do you think that there was a heyday recently of that and it's going to die down, or do you think that will be a threat in our democracy, in the American democracy and other European democracies?
I think we should see Russian interference as an ongoing threat. We've got at the end of September we have the German federal elections.
Yes.
There are reports there of Russian-backed disinformation campaigns asserting that there will be fraudulent voting, that the election system isn't safe. They know it's going to be a highly contested election, very close.
They've learned a lot from what happened with Trump.
There are they believe there's been concerted efforts to undermine the Green Party because the Russians don't want a party in government in Germany that is anti-fossil fuel, which is a major source of their revenue. We have to see, I think, foreign-backed disinformation in different countries, different contexts, different people behind it, as a constant factor in politics and democracy today. In countries where they've got weak traditional media and where you've got countries that are internally divided, these tools and tactics are used to widen those divides and make people even less trusting of their governments. And we have to...
Did the Russians not practice that on their own people first?
And
then took this evolved model to then start monkeying around in our business.
And certainly, I think in particular around their invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
That I think was one of the big testbed areas, and then they've applied that technology elsewhere as well, and they understand and they use in a very sophisticated way the ad tools that companies like Facebook have
They'd
created.
been prepping it well. I mean,
Yeah.
our RT was actually quite a cool channel when that came around, and then suddenly it pivoted hard to supporting the Russian government. It lost various anchors for it, and it became much more obvious underbelly at that stage. But it's certainly something where they've been trying to make headway into the soft belly of our free speech and open democracy for a while.
And if you say their strategy is, I mean, they want, if their strategy is to say, well, we want to weaken Europe, we want to make Europe more divided, we want to make the EU a weaker institution, we want to, we'd like to weaken NATO as an institution. They're looking constantly for things that cause division and undermine trust in institutions.
And cause distrust in government as well.
And government and all public institutions and in the mainstream media, that's what they're looking to do all of the time. They don't particularly mind which argument that they have to push to do it. That's their longer term objective. And it's a constant factor. I think
to be slightly annoying to you on that front, I mean, this is also what genuinely and deeply bothers me. If our government, if all of our political parties collectively don't keep a tight shop on how they behave themselves, it adds all of that emotive fuel that allows so much more playing around by other governments when there's a lot of distrust going around because people don't trust the facts and figures coming out of government and opposition parties and things like that. So but that's important for me.
But in the past, the most effective response to dodgy statistics and dodgy claims has been public challenge through the media, through parliaments, where governments and people in authority are challenged on what they've said and made to justify it, or it's demonstrated what they've said is not accurate. And many politicians have paid a heavy price for being on the wrong side of that line. Where it gets more dangerous though, and if you look at increasingly totalitarian or populist governments,
to the public.
No, it's down to open challenge and scrutiny. But
By whom? I mean, who leads on this?
Well, in the past, often the media has played a very big role in this. But what I'm saying is, what is different in the social media age is if people live in personalized channels where they're unaware of that criticism, that criticism exists, that the facts are disputed. They're not given any information that helps them qualify what they're seeing. And that's why this is a different sort of space. Because we've relied on that open, in an open liberal democracy, we've relied on that challenge to people in authority, the right that people have to speak truth to power, to challenge that authority. But if you move to
you're not genuinely brainwashed if you're hearing a variety of different arguments where people are scrutinizing each other. But if you live in a selective bubble which is only drinking in one stream, then that is effectively brainwashed.
And if you look at the history of kind of totalitarian governments, the rise of sort of fascism, and is that what those organizations do when they seize power is one of the first things they do. They attack and undermine and close down
the challenge.
The challenge.
So we should probably wrap up at this stage, and the aim of all of this is to this series, this podcast, is to look at what is troubling at the moment in this world to our planet, to our ways of existence. And what are the things that need to be done? If, there's the political will, the finances, whatever, what is it that needs to be done in order to get really on the front foot with the fixes? So if you had to pick 3 things that you would like to see done, if not overnight, as quickly as possible, if it could just be done, what would be those 3 things?
First, you've got to recognize that self-regulation doesn't work. The companies will not do what is required because the current model suits them very well.
So the establishment of a regulator. And is that country by country, or is there some kind of international dimension to it as well?
Firstly, it can be done country by country because the companies still have to follow local laws where they do business.
Is there any added benefit to such national regulators working together internationally?
Yes, absolutely. I think in some ways what we could do with is, and other people have called for this before, a kind of what they call a kind of Bretton Woods for tech. Bretton Woods was set the financial rules for the post-Second World War period. I think we should say for democracies around the world, the UK, the EU, Australia, US, Canada, countries like that, to say what do we think are the basic common standards that should apply.
So kind of like a global council of online health.
Yeah, The thing number two is that the regulators have to have the legal power to audit and inspect the companies. So when something goes wrong, they can go in and say, okay, you have publicized footage of a terrorist atrocity and you've distributed it around the world and it's been distributed by far-right groups that are glorying in what has been done. We want to see what went wrong. We want access to live data and information. We want to see who was responsible for those decisions that you made and that you could be held legally to account for that. If a bank sees suspicious trading, it thinks it could be fraud or money laundering, it has to report it to the Financial Conduct Authority. We don't have the same mechanism built into tech. And I think like in other sectors, we need the people that run these companies to think, okay, there are various things I need to be doing to comply with the regulations. In terms of the perpetrators, well, there is the law. I mean, most of what we'd be discussing would be things that are offences anyway. So harassment is an offence. Incitement.
So the law is already sufficient.
Well, it's only sufficient if you can identify who's doing it. Users are not very empowered in this system at the moment, and that is one of the reasons I think they're unable to escape these harms.
Yeah. Well, I think we've got our three things that give good, clear structure on where we need to go. So I'm happy with that. When are we going? Last question, very briefly. When are we going to see that in the UK?
So the committee I'm chairing is scrutinising the draft online safety bill. We have to report to Parliament and the government by the 10th of December this year, and we're expecting the government to introduce the legislation into Parliament in the new year.
Okay. Thank you very much,
Damian
Collins. Thanks. Well, I hope you really enjoyed that show. If you did, of course, share, like, subscribe, and also comment about what you thought and what you would like to see next.